Margaret Caldwell didn't bother lowering her voice. The accusation came sharp and public, cutting through the quiet conference room of Langford and Pierce like a blade. "She married my son for money," Margaret said, staring directly at Lacey Whitfield. "Let's stop pretending. She's a gold digger." Several members of the Caldwell family shifted in their chairs, some uncomfortable, others quietly approving. Adrian looked stunned. The insult hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Lacey didn't defend herself. She didn't argue. She simply folded her hands and waited. Across the table, the family lawyer, Thomas Langford, opened a sealed envelope. "Before anyone says another word," he said calmly, "we should read Eleanor Whitfield's will." In less than 60 seconds, the entire room would fall silent. If you believe that truth has a quiet way of revealing itself at the right moment, stay with this story until the very end. Before we continue, take a second to comment below. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Stories like this remind us that dignity doesn't always speak loudly, but it always leaves an impact. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about justice, resilience, and the quiet strength of people who refuse to be underestimated, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next one. The people who underestimated Lacey Whitfield often made the same mistake. They mistook quiet for weakness. They mistook restraint for submission. And because Lacey rarely corrected them, the misunderstanding had time to grow into certainty. At 32, Lacey Whitfield had built a life that appeared simple from the outside. She lived in a modest brownstone apartment in Cambridge, a place that overlooked a narrow street lined with old maple trees and brick sidewalks, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Her mornings were quiet. Coffee brewed slowly. The news played softly in the background. By 7:30, she would already be at her desk reviewing documents before heading to the office. Lacey worked as a legal operations manager for a nonprofit organization in Boston that provided legal aid to people who could not afford representation. It wasn't glamorous work. It didn't pay like the private firms across the river in downtown Boston. But the work mattered. Every day she handled contracts, compliance records, case tracking systems, grant reports, and financial transparency documents. The organization relied on her to keep everything structured and precise. And Lacey had always been precise. Her desk reflected that. Folders labeled clearly, digital backups stored in multiple systems, emails archived carefully, notes written neatly in small black notebooks she kept for years. Most people assumed the habit came from her profession. In truth, it came from the woman who raised her. But before anyone understood that part of the story, they noticed something else first. They noticed Adrian Caldwell. Adrian was not the type of man who blended into the background. At 35, he was tall, composed, and carried the quiet confidence of someone who had grown up in a world where doors rarely stayed closed for long. His suits were tailored, his schedule packed with meetings, and his last name carried weight in Boston's financial circles. The Caldwell family had been involved in real estate and investment for 3 generations. Their company owned commercial properties across New England and held stakes in several private investment funds. In certain rooms, the Caldwell name meant influence. Adrian worked as a partner in the family's investment firm, Caldwell Strategic Holdings. He was known among colleagues for being methodical and thoughtful, less aggressive than some of the other partners, but respected for his judgment. The first time Adrian met Lacey Whitfield, he wasn't expecting to remember her. The event had been a charity fundraiser hosted in a renovated warehouse near the Boston waterfront. A mix of nonprofit leaders, corporate donors, and legal professionals gathered beneath soft lighting and quiet jazz music. Adrian attended out of obligation. Lacey attended because she helped organize the event. She stood near a registration table, checking names against a list and handing out name badges with calm efficiency. Her dress was simple dark blue, professional without drawing attention. Adrian first noticed her because she was the only person in the room who seemed completely unaffected by the social choreography happening around her. People laughed too loudly at jokes. They leaned in toward potential donors. Conversations shifted, depending on who approached. Lacey didn't change her tone for anyone. When Adrian stepped forward to check in, she looked up briefly. Name Adrian Caldwell. She found the name immediately. Welcome. Your table is toward the back near the windows. No sudden excitement, no shift in posture. Just the same steady professionalism she had shown everyone else. It surprised him. Later in the evening, Adrian saw her again while she was helping one of the organizers review some financial paperwork for the event expenses. She spoke quietly, explaining something about compliance, reporting requirements for nonprofit donations. Adrian lingered nearby longer than he intended. By the end of the night, he had asked if she wanted coffee sometime. Lacey had considered the question for a moment before answering. Coffee is fine. Their first date happened in a small cafe in Cambridge that Adrian would never have discovered on his own. The place had mismatched chairs and old wooden tables scratched with decades of use. They talked for 3 hours. Not about money, not about status, about books, about the way Boston felt different in winter than in summer, about why Lacey believed legal access should never depend entirely on income. Adrian found himself listening more than speaking. And for someone who had grown up in rooms where conversations were usually competitions, that felt strangely comfortable. Over the following months, their relationship unfolded quietly. There were no extravagant gestures, no social media announcements, no public displays designed to impress anyone. Just dinners, long walks along the Charles River, and conversations that stretched late into the evening. Eventually, Adrian did what he knew would become unavoidable. He told his parents. The Caldwell family lived in a historic townhouse in Beacon Hill, one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Boston. The house had tall windows, polished hardwood floors, and walls lined with framed photographs of family events, business milestones, and charity galas. Margaret Caldwell cared deeply about those photographs. To her, they represented something important: legacy. Margaret had spent decades maintaining the Caldwell family's reputation in Boston society. She hosted charity events served on museum boards and carefully curated the family's public image. Her son's future in her mind was supposed to reflect that legacy. So when Adrian mentioned that he had been seeing someone for several months, Margaret listened with interest, at first. "What does she do?" Margaret asked. "She works in nonprofit legal administration," Adrian said. Margaret paused briefly. Nonprofit. She helps manage legal operations for a legal aid organization. Margaret's expression remained neutral. And her family. Her parents passed away when she was young. She was raised by her grandmother. Margaret nodded slowly. What did the grandmother do? She was an estate attorney. Her name was Lacey Whitfield. That detail meant nothing to Margaret. But she filed the information away anyway. The first time Margaret Caldwell met Lacey Whitfield, she had already decided something important. She decided that she would observe carefully. Because in Margaret's experience, people revealed their intentions if you watched long enough. When Lacey arrived at the Caldwell townhouse for dinner, she brought a small gift, nothing extravagant. A carefully wrapped hardcover book about Boston legal history. Margaret noticed that immediately. Not expensive, thoughtful, calculated. Margaret couldn't tell yet. During dinner, Margaret asked polite questions about Lacey's job, about the nonprofit, about how she and Adrian met. Lacey answered each question calmly, never elaborating more than necessary. She did not ask about Caldwell investments. She did not comment on the house. She did not appear impressed by anything around her. That unsettled Margaret more than enthusiasm would have. Most people showed at least some reaction when they first stepped into the Caldwell home. Lacey did not. Later that evening, after Adrian and Lacey left, Margaret stood in the kitchen speaking quietly with her husband Richard. "What do you think?" Richard asked. Margaret dried a wine glass slowly. "She's very composed. That's not a bad thing." "No," Margaret said. "But it can be." Richard raised an eyebrow. "You think she's hiding something?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. She simply placed the wine glass back in the cabinet. I think she said finally we should learn more about her. And in the weeks that followed, Margaret Caldwell began paying closer attention to the quiet woman her son had brought into their world. What Margaret did not realize, what no one in the Caldwell family realized, was that Lacey Whitfield had spent most of her life being underestimated. And people who underestimate someone patient often discover the truth much later than they expect. Margaret Caldwell believed that the first dinner revealed everything. In her experience, a person's true intentions surfaced when they were placed in an unfamiliar room, especially a room that reminded them of what they did not have. The Caldwell townhouse on Chestnut Street had been in the family for nearly 80 years. The building itself carried a quiet kind of authority: red brick exterior, tall iron railings, narrow steps, polished by generations of visitors. Inside the house felt larger than it appeared from the street. The ceilings were high. Antique chandeliers cast warm light across dark wood floors. Portraits of past Caldwell family members hung along the staircase, their expressions calm and confident, as though they had always known their descendants would inherit the same sense of certainty. To Margaret, the house was more than property. It was proof of stability. And stability was something she guarded carefully. The night Adrian brought Lacey for dinner, Margaret had arranged everything with deliberate precision. The dining table was set with china she used only for important guests, silverware polished, wine selected in advance. Margaret told herself it was simply good hosting. But the truth was simpler. She was evaluating the woman who might one day become her daughter-in-law. Adrian arrived first, stepping inside the townhouse with a familiar ease that came from growing up there. Lacey followed a moment later. She paused briefly in the foyer, not in awe, but simply orienting herself. Her coat was dark gray, practical for the late autumn weather. She held it folded neatly over her arm as Adrian introduced her. "Mom, Dad, this is Lacey." Margaret approached with a practiced smile. "Lacey, it's nice to finally meet you." Her handshake was firm. Lacey returned it with equal steadiness. "Thank you for inviting me, Mrs. Caldwell." Margaret noticed two things immediately. First, Lacey did not seem intimidated. Second, she also did not attempt to impress. Some guests spoke too loudly in large homes like this, filling the space with nervous energy. Others grew overly polite, as though afraid to touch anything. Lacey simply stood there comfortably. Margaret filed that observation away. Richard Caldwell soon joined them, offering a warmer greeting. "Adrian's told us about your work," he said. Lacey nodded. "I hope only the good parts." Richard laughed. "Nonprofit work usually doesn't come with many bad parts, just long hours." "That's accurate," Lacey said. They moved toward the dining room shortly afterward. Dinner began with light conversation. Margaret preferred to begin these evenings gently. She asked about Lacey's commute into Boston, about the nonprofit organization she worked for, about how long she had lived in Cambridge. Lacey answered each question clearly but briefly. She did not volunteer extra details. Margaret noticed that too. People who were eager to belong often over-explained themselves. They talked about accomplishments, connections, plans. Lacey did none of that. Halfway through dinner, Margaret began asking more specific questions. "How long have you worked in legal administration?" she asked. "About 9 years. And before that, I studied public policy and legal studies in college." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "Which university? Boston University?" Margaret nodded again. "Not Ivy League." Another observation stored quietly. "And your parents?" Margaret asked after a pause. The question landed gently, but its purpose was clear. Lacey's expression did not change. "They passed away when I was young." Adrian shifted slightly in his chair, glancing at his mother. Margaret kept her tone polite. "I'm sorry to hear that." Lacey nodded once. "I was raised by my grandmother." "And what did she do?" "She was an estate attorney." Margaret's eyes flickered briefly with interest. "Practicing for most of her career, yes. Retired now. She passed away earlier this year." There was a moment of silence. Margaret took a sip of wine, processing the information. An estate attorney. That suggested some degree of financial literacy. But Margaret had never heard the name Eleanor Whitfield in Boston legal circles, and Margaret knew many of those circles. So Margaret said gently, "You and Adrian met through work." "A charity event," Lacey said. Adrian smiled slightly. "She was helping run it." Margaret looked at her son. "And you asked her out?" Adrian nodded. "Yes." Margaret turned her attention back to Lacey, and things moved quickly. The question was phrased lightly, but the implication was unmistakable. Lacey did not react. "We spent time getting to know each other," she said. Margaret allowed a small smile. "Of course." Across the table, Richard seemed content with the conversation. But Margaret was not finished. Toward the end of the meal, Adrian briefly stepped away to answer a phone call. Margaret waited until the sound of his voice faded into another room. Then she spoke again. "Boston can be complicated," she said calmly. Lacey looked at her. In what way? Margaret folded her hands neatly beside her plate. "Certain families have been here a long time. There are expectations, traditions." Lacey listened without interrupting. Margaret continued. "People sometimes misunderstand those traditions if they're new to the environment." It was not an accusation. Not yet. Just a warning disguised as advice. Lacey nodded slowly. "I understand." Margaret watched her carefully. "Do you? Yes." Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair. "And what exactly do you understand?" Lacey's answer came without hesitation. "That reputation matters here." Margaret's eyes narrowed, almost imperceptibly. And that people often assume they know each other before they actually do. For the first time that evening, Margaret felt something unexpected. Uncertainty. The conversation ended shortly after Adrian returned to the table. Coffee was served in the sitting room. The atmosphere softened slightly as the evening drew to a close. Eventually, Adrian and Lacey prepared to leave. Margaret walked them to the door. "It was nice meeting you, Lacey," she said. "Thank you for dinner." Lacey stepped outside into the cool Boston night. The streetlights cast long shadows along the quiet Beacon Hill sidewalks. As Adrian helped her with her coat, he glanced at her. "You handled that well." "Handled what? My mother's questions?" Lacey gave a small shrug. "She was curious." Adrian laughed softly. That's one word for it. They walked together down the street toward Adrian's car. Inside the townhouse, Margaret stood at the window, watching them leave. Richard joined her a moment later. "Well?" he asked. Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched as Lacey and Adrian disappeared around the corner. Finally, she spoke. "She's careful." Richard frowned slightly. "That's not unusual." "No," Margaret said quietly. "But it's interesting." Richard turned toward her. "You still think she's after something?" Margaret looked back at the empty street. "I think," she said slowly, "people rarely enter families like ours without a reason." And somewhere in Margaret Caldwell's mind, a suspicion had already begun forming. A suspicion that would grow steadily over the coming months. One that would eventually lead to a single word spoken aloud in a quiet law office. Gold digger. But that moment was still far away, and for now, Lacey Whitfield continued living exactly as she always had, unaware that someone had already begun measuring her worth against the wrong assumptions. Long before the Caldwell family ever heard her name, Lacey Whitfield had grown up in a very different kind of house. The small Cambridge home where she spent most of her childhood stood on a quiet side street shaded by tall elm trees. It was older than many of the surrounding buildings, with weathered white siding and narrow windows that rattled softly when the winter winds came through the city. To most people passing by, it looked ordinary. To Lacey, it was the center of everything that had shaped her. It was the home of Eleanor Whitfield. Eleanor Whitfield had never been the kind of woman who spoke loudly. Her voice was steady, deliberate, and used carefully. But when she did speak, people tended to listen. For nearly 40 years, Eleanor had practiced estate law in Boston. Her work focused on wills, trusts, and the quiet legal arrangements that determined where fortunes moved after people were gone. She had seen families argue over money. She had watched siblings turn against each other She had witnessed how quickly politeness disappeared when inheritance was involved. Over time, Eleanor developed a simple belief. Money did not change people. It revealed them. When Lacey came to live with her at the age of 8, Eleanor adjusted her life without complaint. Lacey's parents had died in a car accident during a winter storm outside Hartford. The news had arrived suddenly, delivered by a state trooper who stood awkwardly on Eleanor's front porch while explaining the situation in careful, formal language. Eleanor listened quietly. When the officer finished, she simply nodded once. Then she asked where her granddaughter was. From that day forward, Lacey Whitfield grew up under Eleanor's roof. Their home was not large. The furniture was old but well-maintained. Books filled nearly every available shelf, many of them legal texts Eleanor had accumulated over decades of practice. Lacey spent afternoons at the kitchen table while Eleanor reviewed documents nearby. Sometimes Eleanor worked silently. Other times she explained things. Contracts, Eleanor once said while marking corrections in red ink, are promises written by people who assume someone will eventually forget what was agreed. Lacey had been 12 at the time. She looked up from her homework. "So you make sure they don't forget," Eleanor gave a small smile. Something like that. Those small conversations became a quiet education. Eleanor never pushed Lacey toward law, but she believed strongly that everyone should understand how systems worked, especially systems involving money and power. So Lacey learned things most children never considered. She learned how wills were structured, how trusts protected assets, how financial records told stories if you knew where to look. But Eleanor also taught lessons that had nothing to do with legal documents, lessons about people. One evening, when Lacey was about 16, Eleanor closed a thick file and leaned back in her chair. "You know what the most dangerous assumption people make is?" she asked. Lacey shook her head. "That kindness equals weakness." Lacey considered that. "Is it?" Eleanor's eyes softened slightly. "No," she said. "But many people believe it is. And when they believe that, they reveal far more about themselves than they realize." Years passed quietly in the Cambridge house. Lacey finished high school and went on to attend Boston University, choosing to study public policy and legal studies. It was not the glamorous path many of her classmates pursued. But she understood something most of them did not. Access to law could change lives. After graduating, Lacey took a job with a nonprofit legal aid organization. The pay was modest. The work was complicated. But the mission mattered. Eleanor approved of that. "You're learning how the real world works," she told Lacey one evening. They were sitting in the living room, a stack of legal files resting beside Eleanor's armchair. "And the real world is rarely fair," Eleanor added. Lacey nodded. "I've noticed." As Eleanor grew older, the pace of her life slowed. She officially retired from legal practice, though former colleagues occasionally called for advice on complicated estate matters. Eleanor rarely refused those calls. Her reputation in certain legal circles remained strong, even if the wider public had never heard her name. Lacey noticed the small changes that came with time. Eleanor's hands sometimes trembled when holding a pen. She walked more slowly through the house. Doctor appointments became more frequent. Yet Eleanor never spoke about fear or decline. Instead, she continued organizing documents, updating files, and maintaining the meticulous habits that had defined her entire career. One afternoon, when Lacey returned home from work, she found Eleanor sitting at the dining table surrounded by folders. "What are you doing?" Lacey asked. "Preparing." For what? Eleanor looked up. For the future. She tapped one particular envelope resting near the center of the table. "This is something I've been working on for a long time." Lacey frowned slightly. "A will?" Eleanor nodded. "And other instructions." Lacey pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "You don't have to rush that." Eleanor's smile was patient. "Estate planning is never rushed. It's prepared carefully." She slid the sealed envelope slightly closer to herself. "This will be handled by a lawyer I trust very much. His name is Thomas Langford." Lacey recognized the name faintly. "I've heard of him." "You probably will again someday," Eleanor said. There was something in her tone that suggested certainty. But Lacey didn't ask further questions. Over the next 2 years, Eleanor's health declined slowly. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet accumulation of small medical realities that come with age. Lacey adjusted her schedule to spend more time at home. She helped manage appointments, medications, and daily tasks. They spoke often during those final months, sometimes about ordinary things, sometimes about the past. But one conversation remained particularly clear in Lacey's memory. It happened during a quiet winter evening while snow fell outside the Cambridge windows. Eleanor sat in her armchair, a blanket resting across her lap. "Lacey," she said, "yes, people will underestimate you." Lacey gave a small laugh. "They already do." Eleanor studied her carefully. "Good." That answer surprised Lacey. "Good, yes." Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "Because when people believe you have nothing, they stop watching carefully." The room fell quiet. Snow continued drifting outside, and when they stopped watching, Eleanor continued softly, "That's when the truth has the most room to appear." Lacey didn't fully understand what Eleanor meant at the time. Not yet. Eleanor Whitfield passed away peacefully the following spring. The funeral was small. A few former colleagues attended. Some neighbors from Cambridge came to pay their respects. Several quiet figures from the Boston legal community stood near the back of the room. One of them was Thomas Langford. He introduced himself to Lacey afterward with a respectful nod. "I worked with your grandmother for many years," he said. "She spoke highly of you." Lacey thanked him politely. At that moment, she believed the chapter of her life shaped by Eleanor Whitfield had come to a quiet close. What she did not know, what no one in the Caldwell family could possibly know, was that Eleanor Whitfield had spent her final years preparing something very specific, something that would not reveal itself until the exact moment it was needed. And when that moment arrived, it would unfold inside a quiet law office in Boston. In front of people who believed that they had already judged Lacey Whitfield correctly, Adrian Caldwell proposed on an evening that felt almost too quiet to be memorable. It was late spring in Boston, the kind of evening when the air along the Charles River carried the faint smell of water and blooming trees. The city had not yet fallen into the heavy heat of summer, and people lingered along the riverside paths, walking slowly as the sun sank behind the skyline. Adrian had chosen the location carefully. Not a crowded restaurant, not a formal event, just a quiet stretch of the river where the lights of the city reflected softly on the water. Lacey had not expected anything unusual that night. They had taken similar walks many times before. But Adrian seemed slightly more nervous than usual. He spoke less. He kept glancing toward the river as though searching for the right moment. Eventually, he stopped walking. Lacey noticed immediately. "What is it?" she asked. Adrian took a slow breath. "There's something I've been thinking about for a long time." Lacey waited. Adrian had always appreciated that about her. She rarely rushed people when they were gathering their thoughts. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. When he opened it, the ring caught the last light of the evening. "Lacey," he said, "I want to spend the rest of my life with you." He didn't give a long speech. He didn't promise anything extravagant. He simply asked the question, "Will you marry me?" For a brief moment, the world around them seemed to grow very quiet. The water moved slowly beneath the bridge. A few distant voices drifted along the path behind them. Lacey looked at the ring, then back at Adrian. She was not the kind of person who made dramatic gestures, but the warmth in her eyes was unmistakable. "Yes," she said. Adrian let out a breath he had been holding for several seconds. He slipped the ring onto her finger. They stood there for a moment longer, neither of them speaking. Eventually, Adrian laughed softly. "My mother is going to have a lot of opinions about this." Lacey smiled faintly. "I assumed that might happen." Adrian shook his head. "You don't understand. My mother has opinions about everything." That statement, while slightly exaggerated, was not entirely untrue. Margaret Caldwell learned about the engagement the following morning. Adrian had intended to tell his parents in person, but Margaret noticed the ring during a video call before he had the chance. She leaned forward toward the screen immediately. "What is that on her hand?" Adrian hesitated. "Well, we were actually planning to tell you tonight." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're engaged." It was not a question. "Yes," Adrian said. There was a brief pause. Margaret's smile appeared a moment later, carefully controlled. "Well," she said, "that's certainly sudden." Lacey spoke calmly. "We've been together for almost a year." Margaret nodded. "Yes, Adrian mentioned that." But Margaret's expression suggested she was already calculating something else entirely. That afternoon, Margaret Caldwell made 2 phone calls. The first was to a private investigator who occasionally handled discreet background checks for certain Caldwell business matters. The second was to a friend who worked in Boston's legal community. Margaret did not consider these actions suspicious. In her mind, they were responsible. Families like the Caldwells did not enter marriages blindly. Within a week, Margaret had gathered a modest file of information about Lacey Whitfield. The results were not what she expected. No debts, no lawsuits, no criminal history, employment stable for nearly a decade at the same nonprofit organization, tax records clean, education straightforward, and financially unremarkable. Margaret read the report twice. Then she leaned back in her chair. "She has nothing," Margaret said quietly. Richard looked up from his newspaper. "That's not unusual. For most people," Margaret replied. "But not for someone marrying into this family." Richard folded the newspaper. "You think she's planning something?" Margaret tapped the file lightly against the desk. "I think she knows exactly what she's doing." Meanwhile, Adrian and Lacey continued planning their wedding with far less suspicion. Their plans were modest compared to what many people expected from a Caldwell wedding. Adrian had suggested something larger, at first a formal venue, hundreds of guests. But Lacey preferred something smaller. "I'd rather the day feel real," she told him, "not like a public event." Adrian agreed easily. The wedding would still be elegant, but it would not be a spectacle. Margaret, however, remained unconvinced. Several weeks after the engagement announcement, she invited Lacey to lunch. The restaurant Margaret selected overlooked Boston Harbor, a quiet but expensive place, known for its polished service and private seating. Margaret arrived early. She reviewed a printed document inside her leather folder while waiting. When Lacey arrived, Margaret greeted her politely. "I'm glad you could come." "Of course," Lacey said. They ordered lunch. For the first 10 minutes, the conversation remained pleasant. Margaret asked about wedding planning, about Lacey's work, about where the couple intended to live after marriage. Then Margaret reached into her folder. "There's something practical we should discuss." Lacey looked at the document Margaret placed on the table. It was a prenuptial agreement. Margaret spoke calmly. Families with significant assets typically arrange legal protections before marriage. It avoids complications later. Lacey skimmed the document quietly. The terms were extensive. In the event of divorce, she would receive no claim to Caldwell family assets, business holdings, or property acquired before the marriage. Margaret watched carefully, waiting for resistance. But Lacey simply closed the document and nodded. "That seems reasonable." Margaret blinked. "You're comfortable with it, yes?" Margaret leaned back slightly. Most people reacted strongly to prenups. They negotiated. They argued. They expressed offense. Lacey did none of those things. She signed the agreement 2 weeks later without requesting a single change. Margaret should have felt reassured. Instead, the opposite happened. Because in Margaret's experience, people who wanted money always fought hardest over legal protections. Lacey had not fought at all. Which left Margaret with only one conclusion. "She's patient," Margaret said one evening to Richard. And patient people, Margaret added slowly, usually have a plan. What Margaret did not understand was that Lacey Whitfield had spent most of her life learning how to recognize assumptions. And assumptions once formed rarely changed until the truth forced them to. But that truth was still waiting. Waiting inside a sealed envelope in the office of a Boston estate lawyer. An envelope prepared by Eleanor Whitfield long before the Caldwell family ever suspected they would one day judge her granddaughter. The Caldwell wedding was the kind of event Boston society expected. Even though Adrian and Lacey had originally planned something modest, the involvement of the Caldwell family gradually changed the scale. Margaret Caldwell had spent decades hosting charity galas and formal gatherings. A wedding, especially her only son's wedding, was not something she intended to keep small. The venue became the Grand Harbor Hotel overlooking Boston Harbor. The guest list expanded quickly. Business partners, board members, distant relatives who had not spoken to the family in years but suddenly found the date available. Lacey did not object. She had learned long ago that some things mattered more to certain people than others. For Margaret, public presentation was one of those things. If the larger wedding helped maintain peace, Lacey was willing to accept it. The morning of the ceremony arrived cool and bright, with clear skies stretching across the harbor. Inside the bridal suite, a team of stylists moved quietly around the room while Lacey sat near the window. Her dress hung beside her, a simple ivory gown with clean lines and minimal decoration. It was elegant without trying to be impressive. Melissa Caldwell, Adrian's cousin, stood nearby adjusting her own dress. "You look surprisingly calm," Melissa said, studying Lacey. "Should I be nervous?" Lacey asked. Melissa shrugged. "Most brides are." Lacey looked out toward the water. "I think the nervous part usually happens before the decision is made." Melissa considered that answer, but said nothing further. Across the hotel, Adrian stood in a smaller preparation room with several groomsmen. Brandon Caldwell. Adrian's cousin poured coffee into small cups while adjusting his tie. "You realize this is the biggest Caldwell event in 5 years, Brandon said. Adrian laughed quietly. "Wasn't supposed to be. Your mother had other ideas. That part was obvious." Margaret Caldwell had been overseeing the event with the focus of someone managing a corporate conference. Every detail had been reviewed, adjusted, and confirmed. Flowers arranged perfectly. Tables spaced precisely. Guest seating organized carefully to avoid social friction. By the time guests began arriving, the ballroom looked immaculate. Tall windows allowed sunlight to pour across the polished floors. White floral arrangements lined the aisle. Soft music drifted through the room as people took their seats. From the outside, everything appeared flawless. Margaret stood near the entrance, greeting guests personally. "Thank you for coming. So glad you could make it." Her smile remained consistent, but inside her thoughts continued to circle the same quiet question. Who exactly was Lacey Whitfield? The background report had told Margaret many things, but it had not explained the woman herself. Lacey did not behave like someone impressed by wealth. She did not attempt to integrate herself into Boston's social circles. She rarely spoke about the Caldwell business. Most puzzling of all, she never seemed eager to prove herself. Margaret had spent months waiting for some sign of ambition, some hint of calculation. But Lacey remained exactly the same. Calm, observant, difficult to read. Guests slowly filled the ballroom. Among them was a man who attracted little attention at first. Thomas Langford arrived quietly and took a seat near the middle of the room. He wore a dark suit and carried the composed posture of someone accustomed to professional environments. Few guests recognized him, but he recognized Lacey. Langford had attended the funeral of Eleanor Whitfield months earlier. At that time, he'd spoken briefly with her granddaughter. He remembered her clearly. Eleanor Whitfield had been one of the most meticulous estate attorneys Langford had ever worked with. When she passed away, she left behind not just legal documents, but instructions. Very specific instructions. Langford had followed them carefully, and today he watched quietly from his seat as the ceremony began. The music shifted softly. Guests stood. Lacey entered the ballroom, slowly walking beside the officiant toward the front of the room where Adrian waited. The sunlight from the harbor windows illuminated the aisle. creating a soft glow around her dress. People turned to watch. Some admired the elegance of the moment. Others, particularly among the Caldwell relatives, studied her more critically. Margaret observed every step. Lacey did not appear overwhelmed. She did not appear overly emotional. She walked with the same steady composure Margaret had seen the night of their first dinner. For reasons Margaret could not explain, that composure unsettled her again. The ceremony itself was brief. Vows were exchanged, promises made, rings placed gently on each other's hands. When Adrian and Lacey kissed, the room erupted in applause. From every visible angle, the event had succeeded. The Caldwell family had hosted a beautiful wedding. Guests moved into the reception hall afterward, where champagne flowed and conversations filled the space. For most of the evening, the atmosphere remained celebratory. But not every conversation carried warmth. Near one of the tall windows overlooking the harbor, Margaret spoke quietly with two distant relatives from New York. "She seems reserved," one of them said. Margaret nodded slightly. "Yes, hard to tell what she's thinking." "That's exactly the problem," Margaret replied. The relative laughed lightly. "Well, Adrian seems happy." Margaret's expression remained neutral. Adrian tends to trust people easily. Later in the evening, another small conversation occurred near the bar. Margaret stood with Brandon Caldwell and a longtime family friend. "She's certainly different," Brandon said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. In what way? Brandon hesitated. "She doesn't seem interested in any of this." He gestured lightly toward the room full of guests. Margaret followed his gaze. "That doesn't mean she isn't interested in something else." The friend chuckled quietly. "You think she's after the Caldwell fortune?" Margaret did not laugh. She took a slow sip of her wine. "I think," she said carefully, "people rarely marry into families like ours without a reason." At that exact moment across the room, Lacey stood near the balcony, speaking with Adrian. The harbor lights reflected softly across the water behind them. Adrian looked relaxed, almost relieved that the ceremony had passed smoothly. "You survived the Caldwell event of the year," he joked. Lacey smiled faintly. "I think I did." Adrian glanced toward the crowd. "My mother seems satisfied." "That's good." "Is it?" Lacey considered that for a moment. "For tonight, yes." Adrian studied her face. "You're very calm about all this." "I expected it." "Expected what?" "The attention." Adrian laughed softly. "You married into the Caldwell family. Attention is part of the package." Lacey didn't disagree. But she also didn't explain something Adrian hadn't noticed. During the evening, she had overheard several conversations, small comments, quiet assumptions, nothing openly hostile, but enough to understand how certain members of the Caldwell family viewed her. She had heard the phrase once already, spoken softly near the edge of the ballroom. "Gold digger." The word had floated through the air briefly before disappearing into the music and laughter. Lacey had not reacted. She had simply remembered it. Because Lacey Whitfield had spent most of her life following one particular lesson. Observe first, react later. And in the months that would follow this wedding, that quiet habit of observation would become more important than anyone in the Caldwell family could possibly imagine. Especially Margaret Caldwell. Because Margaret's suspicions were not fading. They were only beginning. The weeks following the wedding settled into something that looked from the outside like an ordinary beginning. Adrian and Lacey moved into a townhouse apartment not far from Back Bay, close enough to Adrian's office, and still within a reasonable distance of Lacey's nonprofit downtown. The apartment was modern, with tall windows and a view of the Charles River if you leaned slightly to the right in the living room. It was comfortable but not extravagant. Adrian had suggested a larger property at first, something closer to Beacon Hill, or even a brownstone owned by the Caldwell family. But Lacey had quietly declined. "I'd rather we start somewhere that belongs to us," she told him. Adrian had agreed without hesitation. For him, the location mattered far less than the life they were building together. For Margaret Caldwell, however, the choice raised questions. She noticed everything. The apartment was rented, not purchased. The furniture Lacey brought into the home was modest, well kept but far from luxurious. And perhaps most puzzling of all, Lacey continued working at the nonprofit organization as though nothing in her life had changed. Margaret expected at least some adjustment. Most spouses entering wealthy families altered their priorities quickly. They joined charity boards, attended society events, shifted toward roles that complemented the family's reputation. But Lacey's schedule remained the same. Each morning, she left for work by 8. Each evening, she returned with a leather tote filled with documents and notebooks. Margaret mentioned it during dinner one Sunday. "You're still working full-time?" she asked. "Yes," Lacey said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You don't need to." Lacey looked at her calmly. "I know." The answer was polite. But it closed the conversation. Margaret said nothing further that evening, yet the silence carried its own weight. Over the next several months, small observations accumulated in Margaret's mind like pieces of a puzzle she could not quite solve. Lacey never asked about Caldwell finances. She did not inquire about the family investment portfolio. She never suggested business connections that could benefit her. At family gatherings, she remained polite, but slightly distant, participating without trying to control the room. For most people, those behaviors would have been reassuring. But for Margaret, they felt suspicious. Because in Margaret's experience, ambition usually revealed itself eventually. One afternoon, Margaret attended a small luncheon with several longtime acquaintances at a private club near the Boston Public Garden. The women seated around the table represented a familiar circle of influence. Museum trustees, charity board members, and wives of executives who had shaped much of Boston's social landscape for decades. Naturally, the conversation turned to family matters. So one woman asked casually, "How is your new daughter-in-law adjusting?" Margaret stirred her tea slowly. "She's settling in." "That's good." Another woman leaned forward slightly. "What does she do again? Legal operations for a nonprofit?" The table grew momentarily quiet. "Still working there?" someone asked. Margaret nodded. "Yes." One of the women smiled sympathetically. "Well, that's admirable." Margaret gave a polite smile in return. But the conversation left her unsettled, because admiration was not the same thing as understanding. Later that week, Margaret invited her cousin Brandon Caldwell to her home for coffee. Brandon worked loosely within the Caldwell investment network, often handling smaller ventures and startup investments that interested him more than traditional real estate deals. He arrived mid-afternoon, dropping into one of the kitchen chairs with casual ease. "So what's the emergency?" he asked. Margaret folded her hands on the table. "I want your honest opinion about Lacey." Brandon blinked. "That's random." Margaret waited. Brandon shrugged. "She seems fine. Fine. She's quiet, polite. Adrian seems happy." Margaret studied his expression carefully. "You don't think she's calculating?" Brandon laughed. "No." Margaret frowned. "You're certain I'm pretty good at spotting opportunists," Brandon said. "That's basically half my job. And Lacey doesn't act like one." Margaret leaned back slightly. "That's exactly what concerns me." Brandon looked confused. "That makes no sense." Margaret spoke slowly. "People who want something valuable rarely show it immediately. They wait." Brandon shook his head. "Or maybe she just isn't interested in Caldwell money." Margaret didn't respond, because that possibility, however logical, did not fit the framework she had built in her mind. Meanwhile, Lacey continued living her life in the same quiet rhythm she always had. Work at the nonprofit remained demanding. Legal aid organizations handled hundreds of cases each year involving housing disputes, employment violations, and financial exploitation. Lacey coordinated systems that allowed attorneys to manage those cases efficiently. She tracked funding sources, maintained compliance records, and quietly fixed problems before they escalated. Her desk remained as organized as ever. Her small black notebooks continued to fill with notes. At home, evenings were calm. Adrian often worked late reviewing investment proposals. Lacey read or organized documents at the dining table. Sometimes they talked about work, sometimes about ordinary things. One evening, Adrian looked up from his laptop. "My mother asked me something strange today." "What was it?" Lacey asked. "She asked if you were planning to leave your job soon." Lacey looked up from her notebook. "Why would I?" Adrian shrugged. "She thinks people change after marriage. Some do." "Are you going to numb?" Adrian smiled slightly. "I didn't think so." The topic faded quickly. But several weeks later, something arrived that quietly shifted the direction of the story. It was a simple email. Lacey noticed it late one afternoon while reviewing documents at her office desk. The sender's name immediately caught her attention. Thomas Langford. She opened the message. The email was brief, direct, professional. "Miss Whitfield, your grandmother, Eleanor Whitfield, left sealed estate instructions with my office prior to her passing. According to those instructions, certain documents must be read in the presence of specific parties. Please contact my office at your earliest convenience to schedule a meeting. Regards, Thomas Langford." Lacey stared at the screen for several seconds. She remembered meeting Langford at Eleanor's funeral. But she had assumed the legal matters surrounding Eleanor's estate had already been settled. Apparently, that assumption had been incomplete. That evening, after returning home, Lacey mentioned the email to Adrian. "My grandmother's lawyer wants to schedule a meeting," she said. Adrian looked curious. "About the estate, I think so. You didn't inherit much, right? Not that I know of." Adrian closed his laptop. "Well, whatever it is, we'll figure it out." Lacey nodded. But later that night, as she prepared for bed, a memory surfaced unexpectedly. A conversation she had once had with Eleanor. "People will underestimate you," Eleanor had said. Lacey stood quietly beside the bedroom window. Boston's lights shimmered across the river outside. Somewhere downtown, in a quiet office filled with legal files and sealed envelopes, Thomas Langford was preparing to follow instructions that Eleanor Whitfield had written long before her granddaughter ever met Adrian Caldwell. Instructions that required one very specific condition: a room, a lawyer, and the presence of the Caldwell family. The email from Thomas Langford stayed in Lacey's mind longer than she expected, not because it sounded urgent. In fact, the tone of the message was almost deliberately calm. The language was formal, professional, and restrained exactly the kind of wording someone like Eleanor Whitfield would have trusted. But the phrase "sealed estate instructions" lingered. Lacey had spent enough years around legal documentation to understand that those words were not chosen casually. That evening, she sat at the dining table in the apartment she shared with Adrian, her laptop open, while the city lights of Boston shimmered through the windows behind her. Adrian walked into the room carrying 2 cups of tea and placed one beside her. "You're still thinking about the email," he said. Lacey nodded. "It's unusual." Adrian took a seat across from her. "Unusual how most estates are finalized quickly unless there's a dispute," Lacey explained. "My grandmother was very organized. If she left additional instructions, it means she wanted them handled at a specific time." Adrian leaned back slightly. "Maybe she just wanted to make sure you received something personally. Maybe?" But Lacey did not sound fully convinced. She opened the email again and reread it slowly. The most interesting part was not what the message said. It was what it implied. Certain documents must be read in the presence of specific parties. "Did he say who else needs to be there?" Adrian asked. "No, that's strange." "Yes." Adrian studied her for a moment. "You're curious." Lacey gave a faint smile. "I learned that curiosity is usually a good response when lawyers send mysterious emails." The next morning, Lacey called Langford's office. The receptionist transferred her almost immediately. Miss Whitfield Langford's calm voice came through the phone. "Thank you for calling. Your email caught my attention," Lacey said. "I assumed it might. Can you explain what this meeting is about?" There was a brief pause. "I can explain part of it," Langford said. "But your grandmother left instructions that certain information should be presented in person." Lacey had expected that answer. "Who needs to attend the meeting yourself?" Langford replied. "Your husband, Adrian Caldwell." And another short pause. "And members of the Caldwell family." Lacey felt a subtle shift in her chest. "My grandmother specifically requested that, yes." Did she say why no? But Eleanor Whitfield was very clear about the conditions. Lacey remained silent for several seconds. Langford spoke again. "I understand that this may feel unexpected. It does. But I assure you," he continued, "your grandmother planned this carefully." That sentence sounded exactly like something Eleanor Whitfield would do. "When would you like the meeting to take place?" Lacey asked. "Within the next 2 weeks would be ideal." "All right," Lacey said. "I'll speak with Adrian." After the call ended, Lacey sat quietly for a moment. The office around her buzzed with the ordinary noise of a busy legal aid organization, phones ringing, printers running quiet conversations between attorneys discussing cases. But her mind had already shifted somewhere else. To her grandmother's dining table, to the sealed envelope Eleanor had once mentioned. "This is something I've been working on for a long time." That evening, Lacey explained everything to Adrian. "She wants your parents there too?" Adrian asked. "Yes." Adrian laughed softly. "My mother is going to assume this is about money." "Probably. And if it is, I don't know," Lacey admitted. Adrian leaned back in his chair. "Well, whatever it is, we should tell them." That conversation happened the following Sunday, during a family dinner at the Caldwell townhouse. Margaret Caldwell had prepared the evening meal herself, something she occasionally did when she wanted to maintain a sense of control over the gathering. The dining room looked the same as it had during Lacey's first visit months earlier. Same polished table, same careful arrangement of wine glasses. But the atmosphere felt subtly different. Perhaps because Lacey now sat at the table as part of the family. Halfway through dinner, Adrian cleared his throat. "There's something we wanted to mention." Margaret looked up immediately. Yes, Lacey's grandmother's lawyer contacted her. Margaret's attention sharpened. "About what?" "Apparently Eleanor Whitfield left some sealed estate instructions," Adrian explained. "The lawyer wants to read them in person." Margaret placed her fork down carefully. "And he asked that our family attend the meeting." Margaret's eyes shifted toward Lacey. "Why, I'm not sure," Lacey said calmly. "Those were my grandmother's instructions." Richard Caldwell frowned slightly. Estate matters usually don't involve extended families unless there's something significant involved. Margaret's gaze remained steady. "Did your grandmother leave you money, Lacey?" The question was direct. Lacey did not seem offended. "I honestly don't know." Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair. "But you suspect something." "My grandmother was a very careful person," Lacey said. Margaret's expression grew thoughtful, and perhaps a little suspicious. "When is this meeting supposed to happen?" Margaret asked. "Next week, if everyone is available." Margaret exchanged a brief glance with Richard. Then she nodded. "Well, she said if Eleanor Whitfield wanted the Caldwell family present, I suppose we should attend." But Margaret's thoughts were already moving ahead of the conversation. Because in her mind, the situation seemed increasingly clear. A grandmother who had practiced estate law. A granddaughter who married into a wealthy family. A mysterious legal meeting involving inheritance. Margaret had spent enough years navigating social and financial circles to recognize patterns. And the pattern forming in her mind was a familiar one. Later that evening, after Adrian and Lacey left the townhouse, Margaret stood in the kitchen, speaking quietly with Richard. "You see what this is, don't you?" she said. Richard poured himself a glass of water. "What?" "She's setting something up." Richard frowned. "That's speculation." Margaret shook her head slowly. "No, it's timing." "What do you mean?" Margaret walked toward the window, looking out at the quiet Beacon Hill street. "First the marriage," she said. "Now a mysterious estate meeting that requires the Caldwell family." Richard crossed his arms. "You're jumping to conclusions." Margaret did not answer immediately. Instead, she thought about the background report she had once reviewed. No wealth, no assets, nothing significant, which meant one thing. If Eleanor Whitfield had left anything valuable behind, it might suddenly elevate Lacey's position. And in Margaret's mind, That possibility carried only one explanation. She planned this, Margaret said quietly. Richard sighed. You don't actually believe that. Margaret turned from the window. I believe, she said slowly, that we're about to find out exactly what Lacey Whitfield wants. Across the city, Lacey stood on the balcony of her apartment, looking out over the river. Adrian joined her a moment later. My mother looks suspicious, he said. She often does. Does this whole situation bother you? Lacey shook her head. No. Why not? Lacey looked toward the lights reflecting on the water. Because my grandmother never did anything without a reason. And somewhere in a quiet Boston law office, Thomas Langford was preparing a conference room for a meeting that Eleanor Whitfield had arranged long before anyone in the Caldwell family began questioning her granddaughter's intentions. The office of Langford and Pierce stood on the 12th floor of a quiet stone building overlooking downtown Boston. From the outside, it looked like many of the city's older law firms, formal, restrained, and deliberately understated. Inside, the atmosphere reflected decades of legal work handled carefully behind closed doors. Mahogany desks, shelves filled with thick legal volumes, conference rooms designed for conversations that often carried financial consequences. On the morning of the meeting, Thomas Langford arrived early. He preferred preparation long before clients entered the room. Legal procedures involving estates could become complicated quickly, especially when emotions and assumptions were already present. And Langford suspected that emotions would not be in short supply today. He placed several folders neatly on the conference table. One contained Eleanor Whitfield's will. Another held additional documents she had prepared. A third contained correspondence and notes Eleanor had left specifically for him. Langford had reviewed those instructions many times since Eleanor's passing. Each time he noticed something new about the care with which she had arranged the moment now approaching. Eleanor Whitfield had been many things in her lifetime, but careless had never been one of them. By 10 o'clock, the first members of the Caldwell family began arriving. Margaret Caldwell entered the reception area with the composed posture of someone accustomed to important meetings. Richard Caldwell followed behind her, his expression more neutral but still observant. Margaret greeted the receptionist politely but wasted little time. We're here for a meeting with Mr. Langford. Of course, the receptionist said. He's expecting you. A few minutes later, Brandon Caldwell and Melissa Caldwell arrived as well. They spoke quietly among themselves while waiting near the conference room. Margaret stood slightly apart from the group. Her mind was busy. Over the past week, she had built several possible explanations for this meeting. Some seemed harmless. Others suggested more complicated motives. But one possibility continued returning. If Eleanor Whitfield had left behind money, even a modest inheritance could shift certain dynamics within the Caldwell family. Margaret did not dislike Lacey, but she did not trust coincidences, and timing in Margaret's experience was rarely accidental. The final arrivals entered shortly after. Adrian Caldwell walked in first. Lacey followed beside him. She wore a simple dark blazer and carried a leather folder under her arm. An old habit whenever legal matters were involved. Margaret watched her carefully as they approached. Lacey's expression looked exactly the same as it always did. Calm, composed, almost unreadable. Good morning, Adrian said. Margaret nodded politely. Morning. No one mentioned the tension already building quietly beneath the surface of the room. Thomas Langford appeared moments later, stepping out of his office with a professional smile. Thank you all for coming. He shook hands briefly with Adrian and Richard before turning to Lacey. Miss Whitfield. Mr. Langford. Langford gestured toward the conference room. If everyone would please take a seat. The room itself was large but quiet, with tall windows overlooking the city skyline. The long conference table reflected the morning light, giving the space a slightly formal atmosphere. Everyone settled into their chairs. Margaret sat near the center of the table. Lacey sat beside Adrian. Langford took the seat at the head. For a moment, the room remained silent. Then Langford opened one of the folders. Thank you again for attending, he began. As I mentioned to Miss Whitfield earlier, Eleanor Whitfield left specific instructions regarding certain documents in her estate. Margaret leaned forward slightly. And those instructions involve our family, yes, Langford said calmly. Margaret folded her hands together. Why Langford did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced briefly at Lacey before continuing. Eleanor Whitfield believed that certain matters should be addressed with transparency. Margaret's expression hardened slightly. That sounds vague. It is intentionally vague until we proceed, Langford replied. Margaret's patience was already thinning. With respect, she said our family rearranged schedules to attend this meeting. If there's a legal matter involving my son or his wife, I believe we deserve clarity. Adrian shifted in his chair. Mom. But Margaret raised a hand. No, Adrian. Let's address this directly. She turned her attention toward Lacey. What exactly is this meeting about? Lacey met her gaze calmly. I told you. My grandmother left instructions. Margaret's voice sharpened slightly. And you had no idea what those instructions were? No. Margaret's eyes narrowed. You expect us to believe that the room grew noticeably quieter. Adrian looked uncomfortable. Mom, this isn't necessary. Margaret ignored him. Instead, she spoke with the careful precision of someone who had finally decided to say what she had been thinking for months. Let's stop pretending we don't see what's happening. No one spoke. Margaret turned fully toward Lacey now. You married my son very quickly. Lacey did not interrupt. You signed a prenup without negotiation, Margaret continued. You never showed interest in our finances. Her tone carried a growing edge. And now suddenly, there's a mysterious legal meeting involving inheritance. Adrian sighed. Mom. But Margaret continued. From where I'm sitting, the pattern looks very familiar. The air in the room felt heavier now. Langford watched quietly but did not interfere. Margaret leaned forward slightly across the table. You're a very patient woman, Lacey, she said. Still no reaction. Margaret's voice finally sharpened into the accusation she had been holding back for months. Let's be honest. You married Adrian for money. Adrian pushed his chair back slightly. That's enough. But Margaret was not finished. She looked directly at Lacey and said the word plainly. You're a gold digger. The sentence landed in the center of the room, like a sudden crack in the air. For several seconds, no one moved. Melissa looked down at the table. Brandon shifted awkwardly in his seat. Adrian looked furious. Mom, you can't say things like that. But Lacey did not react at all. She did not defend herself. She did not argue. Instead, she simply folded her hands on the table and looked toward Thomas Langford. Langford watched the room quietly for a moment longer. Then he reached for the sealed envelope resting inside the folder before him. His voice remained calm. Before anyone says another word, he said, I believe it would be appropriate to read Eleanor Whitfield's will. Margaret leaned back slightly, her expression still firm. Fine, she said. Langford broke the seal. The sound of the envelope opening echoed softly in the silent conference room. And within the next few minutes, the assumptions that had been building inside Margaret Caldwell's mind for months would begin to collapse under the weight of a truth Eleanor Whitfield had prepared long before this meeting ever took place. The sound of the envelope opening was small. But inside the quiet conference room of Langford and Pierce, it carried weight. Thomas Langford removed several neatly folded documents and placed them carefully on the table in front of him. The paper itself was thick and formal, the kind used for official estate documents that would one day sit inside courthouse archives. No one spoke. Margaret Caldwell leaned back in her chair, arms crossed loosely, her expression still firm from the accusation she had made only moments earlier. Across the table, Adrian sat stiffly, the tension in his shoulders obvious. Brandon and Melissa exchanged brief glances, but remained silent. Lacey Whitfield sat exactly as she had before, hands folded, back straight, watching. Langford adjusted his glasses slightly before speaking. Eleanor Whitfield's last will and testament was finalized 3 years before her passing he began. It was reviewed annually and updated with minor revisions, but the central provisions remained unchanged. He glanced briefly at Lacey. "Your grandmother was a meticulous woman." Lacey nodded faintly. "Yes, she was." Langford continued. "Before I read the specific allocations, I want to clarify something about Eleanor Whitfield's legal history." Margaret shifted slightly in her chair. Langford spoke calmly, his voice steady and professional. Eleanor Whitfield practiced estate law in Boston for nearly 4 decades. During that time, she specialized in complex asset structures, multi-generational trusts, and long-term estate planning. Margaret's expression softened slightly, not with sympathy, but with curiosity. Langford continued. Many of her clients were individuals who preferred privacy over public recognition. As a result, Eleanor Whitfield's name was not widely known outside certain legal circles. Margaret's gaze flickered briefly. Langford turned the first page. "I will now begin reading the primary provisions of the estate." The room remained silent. Langford read slowly. "I, Eleanor Grace Whitfield, being of sound mind and legal capacity, do hereby declare this document to be my final will and testament." He paused briefly before continuing. "Upon my passing, the majority of my estate shall be transferred to my granddaughter, Lacey Whitfield, who has been both my family and my closest companion throughout the final years of my life." Margaret glanced at Lacey briefly. Still no reaction. Langford continued reading. "This inheritance includes, but is not limited to, the following assets." He turned the next page. 3 residential properties located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Richard Caldwell sat slightly straighter. Langford continued. 2 commercial properties located in downtown Boston, currently leased under long-term agreements. Margaret's expression shifted. Only slightly. But enough. Langford read the next line without changing his tone. "Equity holdings in Whitfield Legal Advisory Group, a private consulting firm established in partnership with several Boston estate attorneys." Melissa looked up. "Consulting firm," she whispered quietly. Langford continued. "Investment accounts held through multiple financial institutions, currently valued at approximately $11 million. This time, the silence inside the room changed. Not dramatic, but unmistakable. Margaret's arms slowly uncrossed. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair. Brandon blinked. Adrian turned his head slowly toward Lacey. Langford continued reading as though nothing unusual had occurred. Various additional assets, including securities, retirement funds, and intellectual property related to Eleanor Whitfield's legal publications. He placed the document down momentarily. For clarity, Langford added calmly, "The total estimated value of Eleanor Whitfield's estate at the time of her passing was approximately $18 million. The words hung in the room. Margaret stared at Langford. "$18 million, she repeated. "Yes." Margaret glanced toward Lacey again. Still calm, still composed. Adrian spoke quietly. "You never told me." Lacey's answer was simple. "I didn't know the full amount." Margaret leaned forward now, her voice sharper again. "Your grandmother was worth $18 million, and you never mentioned it." Lacey met her gaze evenly. It never seemed relevant. Margaret let out a short breath that almost sounded like disbelief. Langford raised a hand slightly. "There are additional provisions." Margaret leaned back again. "Of course there are." Langford turned another page. "In addition to the personal inheritance granted to my granddaughter, I have established the Eleanor Whitfield Legal Foundation." He glanced around the room before continuing. "This foundation will provide legal assistance and financial support to individuals, particularly women who are victims of financial exploitation or coercive financial control." Lacey's eyes softened slightly. She had not known about that part. Langford continued. "The foundation will be funded initially with $6 million from the estate, with Lacey Whitfield designated as its primary trustee." Adrian looked surprised again. "You're running a foundation?" Lacey shook her head slightly. "I didn't know." Langford nodded. "Your grandmother finalized that structure shortly before her retirement." Margaret tapped her fingers lightly on the table. "So your grandmother was wealthy?" "Yes," Langford said calmly. Margaret looked toward Lacey again. Very convenient. Adrian frowned. Mom. But Margaret continued. You still married my son knowing he came from money. Lacey did not respond. Langford cleared his throat gently. There is one final section Eleanor Whitfield requested that I read aloud in this meeting. Margaret gestured impatiently. Well, go ahead. Langford lifted the final page. In my years of legal work, I have observed that wealth often reveals more about people than poverty ever does. The words carried Eleanor Whitfield's unmistakable voice. Langford continued. My granddaughter, Lacey Whitfield, has been underestimated by many people during her life. This has never concerned me. Underestimation often exposes the character of those doing the judging. Margaret's expression tightened. Langford read the final lines. For that reason, I have requested that certain members of the Caldwell family be present when this document is read. I believe the circumstances of this moment will provide useful clarity for everyone involved. Langford lowered the page slowly. No one spoke. The meaning of Eleanor Whitfield's words lingered quietly in the room. Margaret looked toward Lacey again. But this time, the certainty in her expression had disappeared. Not entirely, but enough to create something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Across the table, Lacey remained exactly as she had been from the beginning. Still calm, still quiet. But the balance inside the room had shifted. And for the first time since the meeting began, Margaret Caldwell no longer looked completely certain that she understood the situation. For several seconds after Thomas Langford finished reading the final line of Eleanor Whitfield's statement, no one in the conference room spoke. Silence had changed shape. Earlier it had been heavy with accusation. Now it carried something else. Calculation uncertainty, the quiet rearranging of assumptions that had seemed stable only minutes earlier. Margaret Caldwell was the first person to move. She reached slowly for the glass of water sitting beside her and took a small sip, her eyes still fixed on the documents in front of Langford. $18 million. The number echoed in her mind. Not because it was extraordinary families in Margaret's social circle often managed assets far beyond that amount, but because it changed the story she had already decided was true. Margaret looked toward Lacey again. Lacey had not shifted position. Her hands remained folded loosely on the table, her posture composed. Adrian broke the silence. You never told me your grandmother had properties, he said. Lacey shook her head slightly. I knew she owned the house in Cambridge. 3 houses, Adrian said. Yes, and commercial buildings. That part is new to me. Adrian studied her face carefully. You really didn't know, no. Langford spoke quietly. Eleanor Whitfield structured many of her assets through private legal partnerships. Those details were not publicly visible. Margaret leaned forward again. So she hid them. Langford corrected her gently. She protected them. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. That sounds like the same thing. Langford did not argue. He simply opened another folder and slid several documents across the table toward Lacey. These are the primary estate transfer records. Ownership changes have already been filed with the appropriate institutions. Lacey glanced down at the papers. Legal descriptions of properties, financial account summaries, trust documentation. Each line carried Eleanor Whitfield's familiar precision. Margaret watched her carefully. If Lacey felt surprised, she showed very little of it. That more than the money itself unsettled Margaret. Most people reacted strongly to unexpected wealth. They expressed shock, excitement, at the very least, curiosity. Lacey displayed none of those things. Margaret spoke again, her voice controlled but sharper than before. You mean to tell me you inherited $18 million? And you're just sitting there? Lacey looked up calmly. I inherited my grandmother's work. Margaret blinked. That's not what I meant. I know. Langford cleared his throat. There is additional financial context that may be relevant. Margaret gestured impatiently. Go ahead. Langford opened another document. While the estate's estimated value at the time of Eleanor Whitfield's passing was approximately $18 million, the current valuation is slightly higher. Richard Caldwell looked up. How much higher? Langford adjusted the page. The Cambridge residential properties have appreciated significantly over the past 5 years. He glanced briefly at Lacey. Their combined value is now estimated at around $9 million. Brandon leaned forward. Just the houses. Yes, Langford continued. The commercial properties in downtown Boston are leased under 20-year agreements to 2 law firms and a financial advisory company. Richard nodded slowly. Long-term tenants. Yes, Langford said, which means the income from those leases is stable. Margaret frowned slightly. How stable? Langford turned the page. Approximately $400,000 per year in combined rental income. The room shifted again. Adrian looked stunned. $400,000. Annually? Yes. Langford continued calmly. And that income is separate from the investment accounts and securities Eleanor Whitfield maintained. Margaret stared at the documents. The numbers were not extraordinary by Boston's wealth standards. But they were far larger than she had imagined when she first looked at Lacey Whitfield months ago. At that time, Margaret had reviewed a background report describing a woman with no visible assets. Now that image no longer existed. Across the table, Warren Brandon spoke quietly. So, Lacey was already wealthy. Langford answered simply, yes. Melissa looked toward Lacey with open curiosity. And you never mentioned it? Lacey shook her head. It didn't seem necessary. Margaret let out a quiet breath. But you married into a wealthy family. Yes, so it was relevant. Lacey met Margaret's gaze evenly. Not to me. Margaret studied her face carefully, trying to find something she could interpret. Pride, calculation, even satisfaction. But Lacey's expression revealed none of those things. Langford continued speaking. The Eleanor Whitfield Legal Foundation will begin operations within 6 months. Initial funding has already been transferred into a managed trust. He turned toward Lacey. You will have full authority over its administration. Lacey nodded once. What was my grandmother's intended focus? Financial abuse cases, Langford said. Particularly situations where individuals are manipulated or controlled through financial dependency. Margaret shifted slightly in her chair. That seems specific. Langford gave a faint smile. Eleanor Whitfield believed financial manipulation was often underestimated as a form of harm. Margaret did not respond, because Eleanor's words echoed uncomfortably against the accusation she had made earlier. Gold digger. The phrase now felt less stable than it had an hour ago. Adrian leaned closer to Lacey. Why didn't she tell you more? Lacey thought for a moment. My grandmother believed people reveal themselves when they think you have nothing. Langford nodded quietly. That sounds like Eleanor. Richard Caldwell spoke for the first time in several minutes. So the estate is already transferred? Yes, Langford said. All primary assets now belong to Miss Whitfield. Margaret's eyes moved slowly between the documents and Lacey. A realization had begun forming, not fully yet, but enough to disturb the structure she had built in her mind. For months, Margaret had believed Lacey Whitfield entered the Caldwell family seeking financial advantage. But the numbers sitting on the table now complicated that assumption. Because if Eleanor Whitfield's estate had always existed quietly privately, then Lacey Whitfield had never needed Caldwell money at all. Margaret spoke again. You could have told us. Lacey looked at her calmly. No one asked. Margaret opened her mouth slightly, then stopped, because that answer was technically true. No one had asked. They had assumed. Across the room, Langford closed the final folder. There is one more matter Eleanor Whitfield requested we address today. Margaret looked up immediately. What now? Langford's voice remained calm. It concerns a condition attached to the estate. The room grew quiet again. And for the first time since the meeting began, Margaret Caldwell felt the faintest hint of unease. Because Eleanor Whitfield had been a lawyer, and lawyers rarely wrote conditions into wills without a reason. The moment Thomas Langford mentioned a condition attached to the estate, the room shifted again. Margaret Caldwell had spent years around contracts, business agreements, and legal negotiations. She knew that a condition in a will was rarely insignificant. It meant intention. It meant planning. And Eleanor Whitfield, from everything Langford had described, had been a woman who planned very carefully. Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair. What kind of condition, she asked. Langford did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened the final folder on the table and removed a thin document clipped together with several pages of legal attachments. This section was added to the estate plan approximately 2 years before Eleanor Whitfield passed away, he said. Lacey listened quietly. She remembered that period. Her grandmother had still been healthy then, though she had begun retiring from regular legal work. Langford continued, the condition applies specifically to the Eleanor Whitfield Legal Foundation. Adrian glanced at Lacey. You're the trustee, right? Yes, Lacey said. Langford nodded. Correct. However, Eleanor Whitfield believed the foundation's mission required a particular kind of independence. Margaret frowned slightly. Independence from what Langford looked down at the document and began reading. The foundation established under my name must remain free from financial or social influence that could compromise its purpose. He paused briefly. For that reason, I require that its governing structure remain separate from any family-controlled corporate entities or business trusts. Richard Caldwell crossed his arms thoughtfully. That's not unusual for charitable foundations. No, Langford agreed. But the next clause is more specific. Margaret's patience was thinning again. Well, let's hear it. Langford continued reading. Should my granddaughter, Lacey Whitfield, ever face pressure, financial, social, or otherwise, to merge the foundation with another family-controlled organization, she is legally required to decline such requests. Margaret raised an eyebrow. That seems unnecessary. Langford looked up. Eleanor Whitfield believed it was necessary. Margaret tapped the table lightly. And why would anyone pressure her to do that? Langford did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned the page. In the event that such pressure occurs, Miss Whitfield is instructed to relocate the Foundation's administrative headquarters away from any environment that could influence its operations. The meaning of the words settled slowly. Adrian spoke quietly. You mean, she would have to move it somewhere else? Yes, Langford said. Margaret frowned. That sounds extreme. Langford gave a small nod. Eleanor Whitfield was known for anticipating problems before they occurred. Margaret glanced toward Lacey again. Did your grandmother expect conflict with our family? Lacey answered honestly. She expected people to underestimate her. Langford continued reading. Finally, I require that the Foundation's trustee maintain full legal control over all financial decisions, including property sales, investment allocations, and philanthropic partnerships. He closed the document gently. That control belongs exclusively to Miss Whitfield. The room fell quiet again. Margaret studied the papers carefully. You're saying Lacey has sole authority over $6 million? Yes, and the rest of the estate, also hers. Margaret leaned back slowly. Her mind had begun adjusting calculations again. But this time, the numbers produced a very different conclusion. Earlier, she had believed Lacey Whitfield entered the Caldwell family seeking financial advantage. Now the opposite appeared closer to the truth. Lacey Whitfield had entered the marriage, already possessing more financial independence than Margaret had ever imagined. Brandon spoke carefully. So the foundation can't be absorbed into the Caldwell Charitable Trust? Langford shook his head. No. Margaret folded her hands again. Our family foundation manages several philanthropic projects already. Consolidation would be more efficient. Langford gave a polite smile. Efficiency was not Eleanor Whitfield's primary concern. Margaret's voice cooled slightly. What was? Langford answered calmly. Independence. Margaret sat very still, because the implication beneath that word was becoming clearer. Eleanor Whitfield had designed this structure deliberately. not simply to leave money behind, but to ensure that money remained outside the influence of others. Across the table, Adrian spoke again. "Does the condition apply to our marriage?" Langford looked toward him. "No." Adrian relaxed slightly, but Langford added, "Eleanor Whitfield did include one additional advisory note." Margaret looked up sharply. "Of course she did." Langford opened a separate page and read, "My granddaughter has always chosen her relationships carefully. I trust her judgment completely. However, if she ever finds herself in a situation where respect is replaced by suspicion, I advise her to remember that financial independence provides freedom of choice." The words carried Eleanor Whitfield's unmistakable voice again. Calm, direct. Margaret's expression tightened, because those words landed uncomfortably close to the conversation that had taken place earlier in the room. Adrian exhaled slowly. "My grandmother was very thorough." Lacey nodded faintly. She always was. Langford placed the documents back inside the folder. With that, the formal reading of Eleanor Whitfield's estate provisions is complete. He looked around the room. Are there any questions? For a moment, no one answered. Margaret stared at the table, because something unfamiliar had entered her thoughts: doubt. For months, she had been confident about Lacey Whitfield's intentions. Now that confidence had fractured. Richard Caldwell spoke quietly. "So the estate is settled?" "Yes, and the foundation will begin operations soon." "Correct." Richard nodded once. "Well, that's impressive planning." Margaret remained silent. Across the table, Lacey closed the folder Langford had given her. The documents rested neatly under her hand. She had inherited property, investment accounts, a foundation. But more importantly, she had inherited something else: her grandmother's careful foresight. And that foresight had anticipated exactly the kind of assumptions that had filled this room only minutes earlier. Margaret finally spoke again. Her voice sounded different now, less certain. "You could have told us about all this." Lacey met her gaze. "My grandmother believed explanations are unnecessary when people have already decided what they believe." Margaret had no immediate answer, because she knew exactly what Lacey meant. Earlier that morning, Margaret had called her a gold digger. And now the room was filled with documents proving that accusation had been built on nothing more than assumption. Langford began organizing the folders on the table. But one final detail remained unspoken. And it was a detail Eleanor Whitfield had anticipated perfectly. Because when people discover they have judged someone incorrectly, their reactions often reveal more about them than the original accusation ever could. After Thomas Langford closed the final folder, the meeting should have ended. From a legal standpoint, everything had been addressed. The will had been read, the estate explained, the conditions clarified. All that remained were signatures confirming that the reading had taken place in the presence of the requested witnesses. But the atmosphere in the room had not yet settled. Silence lingered longer than necessary. Not the comfortable silence that follows finished business, but the kind that appears when people realize they may have misunderstood something important. Margaret Caldwell had not moved. Her gaze rested on the polished surface of the conference table, where the reflection of the documents created faint shapes in the wood. For months, she had believed she understood Lacey Whitfield, the quiet woman who entered the Caldwell family without displaying ambition, the woman who signed a prenuptial agreement without hesitation, the woman who seemed almost indifferent to the wealth surrounding her. Margaret had interpreted that behavior in one very specific way: patience, calculation, strategy. But now the facts in front of her had disrupted that narrative, because Lacey Whitfield had never needed Caldwell money. And that left Margaret confronting a question she had not considered before. If Lacey had not married Adrian for financial gain, then what had she married him for? Across the table, Adrian leaned slightly toward Lacey. "You're doing okay?" he asked quietly. Lacey nodded. "I'm fine. You look calmer than everyone else." Lacey gave a faint smile. My grandmother prepared me for unexpected conversations. Adrian glanced briefly toward his mother before lowering his voice. I'm sorry about what she said earlier. Lacey did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked at the documents in front of her again. Words reveal more about the speaker than the person they're aimed at, she said. The sentence sounded almost identical to something Eleanor Whitfield might have said. Adrian exhaled slowly. That still shouldn't have happened. Lacey placed one of the documents back inside the folder. It did. Across the room, Brandon Caldwell finally broke the quiet tension. Well, he said cautiously, this meeting turned out a lot different than I expected. Melissa nodded. Same. Margaret still had not spoken. Richard Caldwell watched his wife carefully. He had been married to Margaret long enough to recognize when her thoughts were moving quickly behind a calm expression. Margaret was not embarrassed easily, but she did not enjoy being wrong, and she disliked public misjudgments even more. Finally, she looked up. Her voice was quieter now. You knew this would happen. The statement was directed toward Lacey. Lacey looked at her. Knew what? That the will would change the conversation. Lacey shook her head slightly. I didn't know what the will contained, as Margaret studied her carefully. But you suspected something. I suspected my grandmother had a reason for calling this meeting. Margaret leaned back in her chair again. And you were comfortable letting everyone think the worst about you until that moment arrived. The room grew still again. Lacey considered the question before answering. My grandmother believed people reveal themselves when they think you have nothing. Margaret recognized the echo of Eleanor Whitfield's earlier statement. And you agreed with that philosophy, Margaret asked. I understood it. Margaret's eyes remained fixed on her. So you allowed people to assume you were a gold digger? Lacey's voice stayed calm. I never confirmed that assumption. Margaret inhaled slowly, because that answer was both frustrating and undeniably accurate. Assumptions had formed inside the Caldwell family long before anyone asked Lacey a direct question about money. And once those assumptions existed, they had grown easily. Quiet dinners, whispered comments, speculation that gradually hardened into certainty. Langford spoke gently from the head of the table. Eleanor Whitfield left one final note in her files for this meeting. Margaret looked up immediately. There's more, Langford nodded. It isn't legally binding, but she asked that I share it if the circumstances seemed appropriate. He opened a thin envelope and removed a single sheet of paper. This appears to be a personal letter. Margaret gestured toward him. Go ahead. Langford began reading. To those present, when this letter is opened, his voice carried Eleanor Whitfield's steady tone again. If you are hearing these words, then the moment I anticipated has arrived. Langford glanced briefly around the room before continuing. I spent most of my life practicing estate law. During that time, I learned something very simple. People often judge others based on incomplete information. Margaret's gaze drifted slowly back to the table. Langford continued. My granddaughter has always preferred a quiet life. She does not measure people by their wealth, and she rarely feels the need to explain herself. Lacey remained very still. If she has been misunderstood by anyone present in this room, I do not consider that a failure on her part. Misjudgment is a choice made by the observer. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly around the arm of her chair. Langford read the final lines. My only hope is that once the truth becomes visible, everyone involved will take a moment to reconsider the conclusions they reached too quickly. Langford lowered the paper. The room felt different again. Not tense, not argumentative, just reflective. Margaret stared at the table for several seconds before speaking. Your grandmother was very confident. Yes, Lacey said quietly. Margaret finally looked directly at her, and very observant. Lacey did not disagree. Langford closed the envelope. That concludes everything Eleanor Whitfield asked me to present today. He slid a document across the table. These are confirmation signatures acknowledging that the reading occurred in accordance with her instructions. One by one, the people in the room signed. Richard, Brandon, Melissa, Adrian. Margaret hesitated slightly before taking the pen, but eventually she signed as well. The meeting was officially over. Chairs shifted, documents were gathered. People began preparing to leave. But something inside the room had changed permanently, because assumptions once spoken aloud could not easily be erased, and neither could the quiet dignity with which someone endured them. The conference room slowly emptied, but the air inside it still carried the quiet weight of everything that had just happened. Folders were stacked neatly, chairs pushed back into place. Outside the tall windows, Boston continued moving through an ordinary weekday morning traffic, flowing through intersections, people walking along sidewalks, the distant sound of construction somewhere across the city. But inside the room, time seemed to move more slowly. Margaret Caldwell remained seated longer than anyone else. Richard had already stepped outside to take a phone call. Brandon and Melissa left a few minutes earlier, speaking in low voices near the reception desk. Adrian stood near the window, with Lacey, both of them watching the skyline. Thoughtful silence. Thomas Langford gathered the final documents and placed them carefully inside his briefcase. Eventually, Margaret stood. She walked toward the window where Adrian and Lacey stood. Adrian noticed her first. "Mom." Margaret didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked out across the city for several seconds before speaking. "Well," she said quietly, "that was unexpected." Adrian gave a small, dry laugh. "That's one way to describe it." Margaret glanced briefly at Lacey. "I suppose I owe you an apology." The words sounded controlled, carefully measured. Lacey looked at her. "You don't owe me anything." Margaret frowned slightly. "That's not entirely accurate." "No," Lacey said gently. "It actually is." Margaret's eyebrows tightened. "You're saying what I said earlier doesn't matter." Lacey considered the question. It already happened. Margaret seemed almost irritated by the calmness of the response. "That's not the point." "What is the point?" Lacey asked. Margaret opened her mouth, then stopped, because she wasn't entirely sure. For most of her life, Margaret Caldwell had been confident in her ability to read people. Social circles like the ones she navigated required that skill. Reputation alliances, business relationships, those things depended on accurate judgment. But today had exposed a rare mistake, and mistakes like that unsettled her. Adrian spoke again. "Mom, the important thing is that we move forward." Margaret glanced at him. Of course. But the tension in her expression suggested she wasn't finished thinking about the situation. She turned back toward Lacey. "Why didn't you correct anyone?" Lacey tilted her head slightly. "Correct what? The assumptions Margaret said. The rumors." Lacey answered simply. "No one asked." Margaret exhaled slowly. "That's a very convenient defense." "It's not a defense," Lacey replied. "It's just the truth." Margaret studied her carefully. "You must have known people were talking." "Yes." "And you didn't care." Lacey's voice remained steady. "I cared about my marriage." Adrian looked at her, surprised by the clarity of the answer. Margaret crossed her arms loosely. "In my opinion," Lacey met her gaze. "I hoped it would change with time." Margaret did not respond immediately, because that statement carried a quiet honesty she hadn't expected. Thomas Langford stepped closer, gently interrupting the conversation. "I'm afraid I have another appointment shortly." Adrian nodded. "Of course." Langford turned toward Lacey. "If you have any questions about the estate transfers or foundation paperwork, my office will be available." "Thank you," Lacey said. Langford gave a polite nod to the rest of the room and left. The door closed softly behind him. For a moment only, the three of them remained. Adrian finally broke the silence. "Maybe we should get some lunch." Margaret gave him a faint look. "You always suggest food when conversations become uncomfortable." Adrian smiled slightly. "It usually works." Margaret shook her head. "Not today." Her eyes returned to Lacey. "I meant what I said earlier about apologizing." Lacey didn't interrupt. Margaret continued, though the words seemed less natural for her than the earlier accusation had been. I made a judgment based on incomplete information. Yes. Margaret raised an eyebrow slightly at the directness of the answer. And you're not angry? Lacey paused for a moment before replying. I'm disappointed. The honesty of the response surprised both Margaret and Adrian. Margaret's posture stiffened slightly. Disappointed? Yes, in me, in the situation. Margaret tilted her head. That sounds diplomatic. It's accurate. Margaret watched her carefully. You still married into this family? Yes. And after everything that's been said, you're staying? The question hung between them. Adrian looked uneasy. Mom, but Lacey answered calmly. My grandmother once told me something. Margaret waited. She said respect is the foundation of every relationship. Margaret nodded slightly. That sounds reasonable. Lacey continued. And when respect disappears, the relationship usually changes. Margaret's expression hardened again. Are you suggesting our family doesn't respect you? I'm suggesting we're still learning how to. The answer was gentle, but clear. Adrian looked between them. This conversation isn't helping. Margaret looked away toward the window again. Outside, the city continued moving, as though nothing unusual had occurred inside the office. Finally, Margaret spoke again. You're a difficult person to argue with. Lacey gave a faint smile. I try not to argue. Margaret looked at her again. That's obvious. Adrian checked his watch. Maybe we should head out. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, I have a meeting this afternoon. They gathered their belongings. Lacey closed the folder containing the estate documents and held it carefully under her arm. As they walked toward the door, Margaret spoke again, this time more quietly. Your grandmother understood people very well. Yes, Lacey said. Margaret hesitated for a moment before adding something unexpected. She would have made an excellent Caldwell. Lacey paused. Then she shook her head slightly. My grandmother preferred independence. Margaret studied her face again. And for the first time since the meeting began that morning, the older woman did not immediately challenge the statement. Because independence, Margaret realized, was something Lacey Whitfield already possessed in abundance. And that independence meant something important. It meant Lacey Whitfield had never needed the Caldwell name. Not for security, not for status, not for money, which meant the reason she married Adrian Caldwell had nothing to do with any of the assumptions Margaret had spent months believing. And that realization left Margaret standing in the quiet hallway outside the conference room, reconsidering everything she thought she knew about the woman who had just become part of her family. By the time they left the building, the morning had turned brighter. Sunlight reflected off the glass towers across downtown Boston, casting long patterns of light across the street below Langford and Pierce. People moved quickly along the sidewalks, unaware that inside the quiet law office above them, several assumptions about one woman had just been dismantled. Adrian walked beside Lacey as they stepped out onto the sidewalk. Margaret and Richard followed a few steps behind. No one spoke immediately. The city noise filled the space where conversation might have been car engines, distant horns, the hum of daily life continuing without interruption. Adrian finally broke the silence. I still can't believe your grandmother left all that. Lacey glanced toward him. She spent her entire life working. Still, Adrian said $18 million is a lot of work. Lacey gave a faint smile. My grandmother believed careful planning was the same thing as patience. Adrian nodded slowly. That sounds like her. They reached the corner of the block where the street split toward two different parking garages. Margaret stopped walking. Adrian? He turned. Yes, your father and I will take the car from here. Richard gave a small nod. That might be best. Adrian looked between them. Are you sure Margaret's expression was composed again, though quieter than usual? Yes. She turned toward Lacey. For what it's worth? Today clarified several things. Lacey waited. Margaret continued. I may have misunderstood your situation. The sentence was not quite an apology, but it was closer than anything Margaret Caldwell had offered earlier. Lacey nodded once. People often misunderstand quiet people. Margaret studied her carefully. I see that now. Richard stepped slightly closer to Margaret. We should go. Margaret nodded. Before turning away, she looked at Adrian. You should call us later. I will. Margaret hesitated for one more second. Then she walked down the sidewalk with Richard disappearing gradually into the flow of pedestrians. Adrian watched them leave before exhaling. Well, he said, that was something. Lacey looked up at the buildings surrounding them. Yes. Adrian turned toward her. Are you upset? Nor unrelieved, not exactly. Adrian frowned slightly. Then what are you feeling? Lacey considered the question for a moment. Clarity. Adrian tilted his head. About what? About how people see things. He waited for her to continue. My grandmother used to say that money is rarely the real issue, Lacey said. What is assumptions? Adrian leaned against the railing beside the sidewalk. I wish I'd asked you more questions earlier. Lacey looked at him. You trusted me. That's not the same as understanding you. Lacey didn't disagree. They began walking slowly toward the parking garage where Adrian had left the car. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Adrian said something quietly. Did you know my mother would say that? The gold digger part, yes. Lacey nodded once. I suspected it. Adrian stopped walking. You suspected it. And you still came today, yes? Why? Lacey turned toward him. Because my grandmother arranged the meeting. That's it. Lacey smiled slightly. My grandmother rarely arranged things without a reason. Adrian thought about the letter Langford had read earlier. Misjudgment is a choice made by the observer. The sentence had lingered in his mind all morning. Your grandmother set that moment up, Adrian said slowly. Yes, she knew exactly what would happen, probably. Adrian shook his head slightly in disbelief. She was remarkable. She was patient. They reached the parking garage entrance. Before stepping inside, Adrian looked at Lacey again. Can I ask you something? Of course. If my family never changed their opinion, would that have affected your decision to marry me? Lacey did not answer immediately. She watched the traffic moving along the street for several seconds before speaking. I married you, she said simply. Adrian waited. Lacey continued. Other opinions matter less than people think. Adrian smiled slightly. I'm glad you feel that way. They walked inside the garage, where the quiet echo of footsteps replaced the noise of the street. As Adrian unlocked the car, Lacey placed the folder containing the estate documents carefully in the back seat. Eleanor Whitfield's name rested on the cover. For a moment, Lacey looked at it thoughtfully. Her grandmother had anticipated nearly every detail of this day. The assumptions, the accusation, even the silence that followed the truth. Adrian noticed her expression. You're thinking about her. Yes. What would she say right now? Lacey closed the car door gently. She'd probably say the same thing she always said. And that was Lacey sat in the passenger seat and looked out through the windshield toward the exit ramp leading back into the city. Time reveals people. Adrian started the engine. And today revealed a lot. Yes, Lacey said quietly. As the car pulled out of the garage and merged back into the flow of Boston traffic, the events of the morning already began settling into memory. The accusation, the will, the quiet reversal of assumptions. None of it required dramatic confrontation. None of it required revenge. Because the truth had arrived in the calm, deliberate way Eleanor Whitfield had always trusted. And when it did, it spoke for itself. Some stories end with loud victories. Others end quietly. This was one of the quiet ones. No shouting. No humiliation returned. No dramatic speeches meant to punish those who judged too quickly. Instead, there was a room, a will, and a truth that arrived calmly, exactly when it needed to. Lacey Whitfield never argued with the accusation made against her. She never tried to defend herself with words. She simply allowed time to do what time often does, best reveal the truth that assumptions try to hide. And when that truth appeared, it didn't need to embarrass anyone. It only needed to exist. Because sometimes dignity is not about proving people wrong. Sometimes it's about allowing them the space to recognize it themselves. Eleanor Whitfield understood that better than most people. She knew that wealth could distort perception. She knew that silence could be mistaken for weakness. And she knew that patience often exposes character more clearly than confrontation ever could. So she left behind more than an inheritance. She left behind a moment. A moment where every assumption in that room had to face reality. And when the room finally grew quiet, the only thing left standing was the one thing Lacey Whitfield had never lost: her dignity. If this story made you reflect on how quickly people can judge and how powerful quiet strength can be, feel free to share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from today? And what time is it where your stories like this remind us that patience, integrity, and self-respect still matter? And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about justice, resilience, and the quiet moments where truth finally surfaces, you're welcome to stay connected with the channel for more. Sometimes the most powerful endings are the ones that arrive quietly and stay with us long after the story ends.